Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight I want to take you somewhere I didn't expect to go myself, a place between history and something far stranger. I used to believe that ancient myths were just stories, poetic attempts by early humans to explain a world they didn't understand. Gods, giants, creation tales, all of it felt symbolic, distant, almost comforting in its simplicity. But then I came across something that didn't quite fit. Across ancient Mesopotamia, carved into clay tablets thousands of years old, there were repeated accounts of beings called the Anunnaki. They weren't just described as gods in the way we usually imagine, they were organized, hierarchical, almost administrative. They had roles, duties, conflicts, even disagreements about what to do with humanity. And that's when something started to shift in me. Because the more I read, the less it felt like mythology, and the more it felt like memory. Not just one story, but many. The same patterns appearing again and again in different cultures, separated by oceans, by centuries, all pointing to something that shouldn't be there. Why would ancient civilizations describe beings who came from the sky, who shaped humans, who demanded labor and then disappeared? At first, I tried to dismiss it. I told myself it was coincidence, metaphor, imagination. But the details, they were too specific. Descriptions of creation, not as magic, but as process, of knowledge given, then taken away, of a time when gods walked among humans, not as distant deities, but as rulers. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more it kept coming back. What if, just for a moment, we've misunderstood our own origin? What if the story of humanity didn't begin the way we were taught? Tonight, we're not here to prove anything, or to convince you of some hidden truth. We're here to explore, to question, to sit quietly with an idea that may feel uncomfortable and see where it leads. Because sometimes the most important discoveries don't come from what we know, but from what we're willing to consider. So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes. I used to believe that all of this was just mythology, stories shaped by imagination, passed down through generations to make sense of a world that once felt mysterious and uncontrollable. Gods in the sky, giants walking the earth, beings with powers far beyond human understanding. It all seemed like poetry to me, symbolic, exaggerated, even comforting in a way. Because if these were just stories, then the world was simple, predictable, explainable. But the more I looked into it, the more that certainty began to slip away. It started quietly, almost by accident, when I found myself reading about ancient Mesopotamia, a region often called the cradle of civilization, the place where writing was born, where the first cities rose from the dust, where humanity, as we know it, began to organize itself into something recognizable. At first, I was only curious about the history, the architecture, the early laws, the beginnings of society. But then I came across something that didn't feel like history at all. It felt different, older, heavier. The Sumerian texts, clay tablets etched with symbols that had survived for thousands of years. And within those texts were stories, detailed accounts of beings called the Anunnaki. Now, at first, I reacted the same way anyone would. I assumed these were just their version of gods, like Zeus in Greece or Ra in Egypt. Mythological figures created to explain natural forces, storms, floods, the movement of the stars. But then I noticed something strange. The way these beings were described didn't quite match the usual patterns of mythology. They weren't just powerful or divine. They were structured, organized, almost like a society. There were higher gods who made decisions and lesser gods who carried out labor. There were conflicts, disagreements, even what sounded like political tension. And that's when I paused, because mythology, at least as I understood it, wasn't supposed to feel this detailed, this systematic. Why would a myth need hierarchy? Why would gods need roles? Why would divine beings be described as working, struggling, even rebelling? It didn't sit right with me. And yet, I tried to brush it off. I told myself I was reading too much into it. That ancient people often humanized their gods to make them relatable, that it was just storytelling, nothing more. But then, another question began to form, slowly, persistently, one that I couldn't quite ignore. Why do so many ancient civilizations separated by vast distances in time describe such similar beings? Beings who come from the sky, who possess advanced knowledge, who shape humanity in some way, and then either disappear or ascend back to the heavens. Mesopotamia had the Anunnaki. Egypt had gods who descended and ruled among men. Mesoamerican cultures spoke of sky beings who brought knowledge and then vanished. Even in ancient Indian texts, there are descriptions of flying machines and celestial visitors. At first, it's easy to say these are just coincidences, that human imagination tends to follow similar patterns. But the deeper I looked, the harder that explanation became to hold on to, because these weren't vague similarities, they were specific, repeated themes shared across cultures that had no known contact with each other. And that's when I felt something shift inside me. Not belief, not yet, but on it. The realization that maybe, just maybe, I had been too quick to dismiss these stories. That perhaps calling them myths was not an explanation, but an assumption. And for the first time, I found myself asking a question I had never seriously considered before. What if these ancient people were not simply imagining things? What if they were describing something they had actually seen, experienced, or remembered in a way that made sense to them? And if that were true, then the question becomes even more unsettling. What exactly were they trying to tell us? And why does it feel like we've forgotten how to understand it? The deeper I went into these ancient records, the harder it became to hold on to the idea that they were simply stories, because these weren't fragments of imagination scattered randomly across time. They were structured narratives, preserved with intention, repeated with consistency, and recorded in ways that suggested they mattered far more than just entertainment or symbolism. I started with the Sumerian tablets, thousands of them, etched into clay with a writing system we now call cuneiform, some of the oldest written records humanity has ever produced. And what struck me wasn't just their age, it was their precision. These weren't vague myths passed down through word of mouth. They were documented, carefully inscribed accounts of events, hierarchies, names, and roles. And among them, over and over again, appeared the same group of beings, the Anunnaki. At first, I told myself this was expected. Every civilization has its pantheon of gods. But the more I read, the more I realized something unsettling. These beings weren't described like distant, abstract deities. They were involved, present, active within the world in ways that felt almost tangible. And then I moved on to the Epic of Gilgamesh, often considered the oldest known epic in human history. A story of a king, part divine, part human, searching for immortality. But hidden within that narrative were references to gods who shaped destiny, who intervened, who controlled forces far beyond human reach. And again, the same pattern emerged. The gods weren't just symbolic. They had personalities, intentions, even disagreements. And then there was the Enuma Elish, a Babylonian creation story describing the formation of the universe, a cosmic battle, a structured emergence of order from chaos. And within it, once again, these beings who governed creation, who organized the world, who established control. It began to feel less like separate stories and more like chapters of the same account, told from slightly different perspectives. And that's when something inside me shifted again, because I started noticing repetition, not just in names or themes, but in structure, in behavior, in the roles these beings played. Higher entities making decisions, lesser ones carrying out tasks. Systems of authority that looked strangely familiar, almost like a reflection of human society, but reversed, as if we didn't create these structures ourselves, but inherited them. And I remember pausing at one point, staring at the text in front of me, and thinking, this is too consistent, too deliberate, too aligned across different sources to be dismissed as coincidence, because coincidence tends to be messy, incomplete. But this felt organized, intentional, almost as if these ancient writers were trying to preserve something they believed was real, something they didn't want to be forgotten. And that's when the thought came back again, stronger this time. What if this isn't just mythology? What if these texts are echoes of something older? something that once existed but has since been reframed as legend because we no longer have the context to understand it. And I tried once again to pull myself back to a more rational explanation. I reminded myself that humans are pattern-seeking by nature, that we connect dots even when they don't belong together. But the more I compared these texts, the more difficult that explanation became. Because the patterns weren't being created by me, they were already there, waiting to be noticed. And that's when I quietly admitted something to myself that I hadn't wanted to say out loud. There is something repeating here, something consistent across time and culture. And whatever it is, it doesn't feel accidental. And then there was something else that I couldn't ignore anymore. Something that didn't just repeat across texts, but reshaped the way I was looking at all of it. Because the more I read, the less these gods felt like gods in the way I had always imagined them. They didn't behave like distant, all-powerful, mysterious beings beyond comprehension. Instead, they felt organized, structured, almost like a society. And that realization unsettled me more than anything else I had found so far. Because mythology is supposed to be symbolic, emotional, chaotic at times. But what I was seeing here was something very different, something systematic, something that followed rules. I began to notice that within these ancient accounts, the Anunnaki were not all equal. There were clear levels of authority, higher gods who made decisions, who dictated outcomes, who determined the fate of both their own kind and humanity. And then there were the others, the ones referred to as the Ijigi, often described as the lesser gods, the ones who actually carried out the work. And I remember reading that part slowly, almost twice, because it didn't make sense at first. Lesser gods doing labor, performing tasks, enduring physical effort. It felt strangely human. And the more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable it became. Because this wasn't just a hierarchy of power. It was a hierarchy of responsibility, of workload, of function. Just like any structured civilization, leaders at the top, workers below, a system built not just on authority, but on labor. And I found myself pausing again, asking a question that felt almost too simple, yet impossible to ignore. Why would gods need workers? If they were truly divine, truly all-powerful, why would they require labor at all? Why would they need others to carry out physical tasks, to build, to extract, to endure hardship? It didn't align with the idea of omnipotent beings. It aligned more with something else entirely. Something limited, something dependent on structure and organization. And that thought stayed with me longer than I expected, because once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. These weren't just stories of creation or divine acts. They were descriptions of a functioning system, one that mirrored almost perfectly the way human societies operate today. Chains of command, division of labor, conflict between authority and those who serve under it. And then I started to wonder something even more unsettling. What if we didn't invent these systems ourselves? What if we learned them? What if the structures we live by today are not just natural developments of human behavior, but reflections of something we inherited from a time we no longer fully remember? And again, I tried to step back, to ground myself in logic, to remind myself that ancient cultures often projected human traits onto their gods, that this could simply be a way of making the divine more relatable. But even that explanation began to feel insufficient. Because this wasn't just about personality traits, it was about systems, about roles, responsibilities, and functions that served a clear purpose. And the deeper I looked into it, the more it felt like I wasn't reading mythology anymore. I was reading something closer to a record, something that described how things operated, not just what people believed. And that realization didn't bring clarity, it brought more questions. Questions that felt heavier, harder to dismiss, because if these beings operated like a structured society, if they required labor, if they divided roles among themselves, then what exactly were they? And more importantly, what was our place within that system? And then I reached the part that I couldn't ignore anymore. The moment where everything I thought I understood began to shift in a way that felt almost irreversible. It came from a text known as the Atrahasis, an ancient Mesopotamian account that, at first glance, seemed like just another creation story, something I had already seen in different forms across different cultures. But this one was different. Not because it was more dramatic or more detailed, but because of how direct it was, how unsettlingly clear it felt. In this account, the lesser gods, the Ajiji, were the ones assigned to do the labor, digging, building, enduring the physical burden that sustained the world as it was described. And eventually, they reached a breaking point. They revolted. They refused to continue. They laid down their tools and demanded relief from the work they could no longer bear. And I remember stopping right there for a moment, because this didn't feel like a myth anymore. This felt like a scenario, like something that followed cause and effect. Pressure leading to resistance, resistance forcing a solution. And then came the decision. The higher gods, the Anunnaki, chose to create a new being, something that could take over the labor, something that could carry the burden so they no longer had to. And that being was us, humanity. And I sat there reading that line again and again, because it didn't align with anything I had grown up believing. Not the idea of humans as the center of creation, not the idea of purpose as something meaningful or spiritual. This was something else entirely, something far more practical, almost cold in its logic. Humans were created to work, to serve as a labor force, to take on the physical tasks that the Ajiki had abandoned. And for a moment, I tried to dismiss it, to categorize it as metaphor, as symbolism, as just another way ancient people tried to explain existence. But something about it resisted that interpretation. It was too specific, too functional. It didn't describe purpose in terms of meaning. It described purpose in terms of utility. And that's when the thought appeared. Quietly at first, but impossible to push away once it formed. Wait, what if we weren't created to live, but to serve? And I remember feeling a kind of stillness after that. Not panic, not fear, just a slow, unsettling awareness that this idea, even as a possibility, changed everything. Because if humanity began as a solution to a problem, if we were designed to fulfill a role rather than simply exist, then what does that say about everything that came after? About civilization, about progress, about the systems we've built and the structures we follow? Are they expressions of freedom or echoes of an original function we've never fully escaped? And again, I tried to ground myself, to remind myself that this was just one interpretation of an ancient text, that many scholars see these stories as symbolic reflections of labor, hierarchy, and human experience, but even that explanation didn't fully settle the discomfort. Because symbolism usually abstracts reality, it softens it, makes it easier to accept. This did the opposite. It sharpened it. It made the idea of human existence feel less like a mystery and more like a design. And that was the moment I realized something had changed. I wasn't just reading these texts anymore. I was questioning everything I thought I understood about where we came from, and more importantly, why we are here. And this is where the question changed for me, because up until that point, I was still trying to understand these accounts within the framework of mythology. Still trying to convince myself that these were symbolic stories shaped by imagination, filtered through culture and time. But then I came across something that didn't feel symbolic at all, something that felt purposeful, almost like a plan. The references to a place called Nibiru, described not as a spiritual realm, not as a metaphorical heaven, but as a physical world, a planet. And what unsettled me wasn't just the idea of its existence, but the reason it was mentioned. Because according to certain interpretations of these ancient texts, Nibiru was not a place of perfection or divine peace. It was a world in crisis. A civilization facing environmental collapse, an atmosphere deteriorating, a system failing, a problem that needed to be solved. And suddenly, the narrative shifted. This wasn't a story about gods creating humans out of whim or divine expression. This was something else entirely. Something that resembled a response to a problem, a search for a solution. And that solution, according to these accounts, was gold. Not as wealth, not as currency, but as a material with specific properties. something that could be dispersed into an atmosphere to reflect radiation, to stabilize conditions, to repair what was breaking down. And I remember reading that and feeling a pause, a kind of quiet disbelief, because this didn't sound like mythology anymore. This sounded like engineering, like science, like a civilization facing a crisis and looking outward beyond their own world for a resource they needed to survive. And then came the next part. They found it here on Earth. And that's when the story took on a completely different weight. Because now, the arrival of these beings was no longer framed as divine descent. It was framed as exploration, as travel, as a journey with a clear objective. They didn't come to be worshipped, they came to extract, to mine, to gather what they needed. And I sat there for a moment, letting that sink in, because it changed the entire context of everything that came before. The hierarchy, the labor, the creation of humans. It all started to align in a way that felt disturbingly logical. Because if a civilization arrived on Earth with a mission, if they needed resources, if they had the technology to travel across vast distances, then everything else that followed suddenly made sense. The structure, the roles, the division of labor. It wasn't mythology. It was operation. And that's when the thought formed again, clearer this time, sharper than before. This is not mythology. This sounds like a mission. And I tried to resist that conclusion. I really did, because it's a leap, a significant one, to move from ancient texts to the idea of extraterrestrial visitors. But the language used in these interpretations, the consistency of the narrative, the focus on problem and solution rather than symbolism, it all pointed in a direction that was difficult to ignore, because myths don't usually explain logistics. They don't describe needs, resources, environmental crises. They don't outline a reason to leave one world and arrive on another. But this did. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that what unsettled me wasn't just the possibility that these beings existed. It was the implication that their presence here might not have been about us at all. That humanity, at least in the beginning, may not have been the focus, but the consequence, the result of something else. A mission that started far away on a world we have never seen, driven by a need we are only beginning to understand. And if that were true, then everything we've been taught about our place in the universe might not be as certain as it seems. And once I allowed myself to consider that possibility, even just for a moment, the next question came almost immediately. How would they have gotten here? Because if this was truly a mission, if these beings came from another world, then we are no longer talking about myth or metaphor. We are talking about travel, distance, technology. And that's where things began to feel even more unsettling, because the descriptions, scattered across interpretations and texts, started to hint at something that sounded far more advanced than anything those ancient civilizations should have been able to imagine on their own. References to vehicles capable of crossing vast distances between worlds, accounts of beings arriving from the sky, not as flashes of lightning or divine apparitions, but as controlled descents. Deliberate, purposeful. And I remember thinking, ancient people didn't have a concept of spacecraft. They didn't have the language for propulsion systems, for atmospheric entry, for interplanetary travel. And yet they kept describing something that felt structured, mechanical, intentional. And the idea that kept coming up in these interpretations was something we now call anti-gravity, a form of propulsion that doesn't rely on force in the way we understand it, but instead manipulates gravity itself, allowing movement without resistance, without the limitations that bind everything we build today. And I'll be honest, this is where I felt that shift again. That quiet moment where curiosity turns into something deeper, something that feels almost like unease. Because imagining that kind of technology isn't just fascinating, it's disorienting. It forces you to rethink what is possible, not just now, but thousands of years ago. And I found myself picturing it. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in silence. A vessel descending slowly through the atmosphere of a much younger Earth. No noise that could be understood, no reference point for the people who might have seen it. Just something appearing from above, controlled, deliberate, real, and then landing. Not as a miracle, but as an arrival. And that distinction mattered more than I expected. because miracles are unpredictable, chaotic, beyond comprehension. But arrivals are planned. They follow intention, trajectory, purpose. And the more I sat with that idea, the more I realized how much it changes the tone of everything that comes after. Because if they arrived here intentionally, if they had the capability to travel between planets, to cross distances that even today feel almost unreachable, then everything about them shifts. They are no longer figures of belief. They are something closer to explorers, or maybe even engineers. And that thought, it didn't bring clarity, it brought a kind of quiet tension. Because once you accept that possibility even slightly, it opens a door that's hard to close again, because now you have to ask, if they had that level of technology, what else did they have? What did they understand about physics, about energy, about life itself? And why does it feel like some of those descriptions, those fragments preserved in ancient texts, echo ideas we are only now beginning to explore? And I remember feeling that subtle shift inside me again. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. A kind of realization that this line of thought doesn't just challenge history, it challenges the limits we place on reality itself. Because if something like this were true, if beings once traveled here from another world using technology far beyond what we can replicate today, then the gap between what we think we know and what might actually be possible is much wider than we are comfortable admitting. And that's when the curiosity started to deepen into something else, something quieter, heavier, because it wasn't just about them anymore, it was about us, about where we stand in a universe that suddenly feels much larger, much older, and far less understood than we ever imagined. And just when I thought the narrative couldn't feel any more grounded, any more strangely familiar, I reached the part that unsettled me in a completely different way. The moment where the so-called gods began to act in a way that felt unmistakably human. Because according to these accounts, the Ajiji, the so-called lesser gods, were not living in some eternal state of divine peace or power. They were working, laboring, enduring physical tasks that were described as exhausting, relentless, and unbearable over time. And at first, I tried to interpret this symbolically. Maybe it represented natural forces, cycles of nature, or even human struggles projected onto divine figures. But the more I read, the harder that explanation became to sustain. Because this wasn't abstract, it was detailed. The Ajiji were said to have grown tired of their labor, overwhelmed by the weight of their responsibilities, pushed to a point where they could no longer continue. And then they did something that completely broke the pattern of what I expected from gods. They rebelled, they stopped working, they laid down their tools and rose up against the higher Anunnaki. And I remember sitting with that for a moment, letting it settle in, because something about it didn't fit the idea of divinity at all. Rebellion implies limitation, frustration, a breaking point, emotions that come from pressure and exhaustion. And that's when the question formed again, almost instinctively, why would gods rebel unless they were more like us? Because rebellion is not a trait we associate with all-powerful beings. It's something deeply human. It comes from imbalance, from inequality, from the feeling of being pushed too far without relief. And suddenly, the entire dynamic between these beings began to shift in my mind. This was no longer a hierarchy of divine perfection. It was a system under strain, a structure where those at the bottom buried the burden, while those at the top made the decisions. And that structure, it felt familiar in a way I couldn't ignore, because we've seen it before in our own history, in our own societies. The tension between those who work and those who govern, the point where effort turns into exhaustion and exhaustion turns into resistance. And I found myself wondering, not just about them, but about the nature of systems like this. Do they emerge naturally, or are they learned? And if these ancient accounts are describing something real, something that once existed, then what we're seeing here is not mythology, it's conflict. It's pressure building within a structured society. And the response that followed that rebellion, the decision made by the Anunnaki, only made it feel more real, more grounded in logic than anything I had expected from a creation story. Because instead of restoring balance through divine power, instead of simply ending the rebellion with absolute authority, they looked for a solution, a way to remove the burden from the Igigi, to replace their labor with something else. And that's when the story began to move in a direction that felt both inevitable and deeply unsettling. Because it suggested that the next step wasn't about resolving conflict, it was about outsourcing it, transferring the burden to another form of life. And as that realization began to take shape, I felt that quiet shift, again, the one that had been following me through each of these texts, that subtle movement from curiosity into something heavier. Because this wasn't just a story about gods anymore. It was a story about systems, about labor, about imbalance, and about what happens when those at the bottom decide they've had enough. And if that sounds familiar, if it echoes something we recognize in our own world, then maybe that's the most unsettling part of all. Because it raises a question that lingers long after the story moves forward. If they were capable of rebellion, of resistance, of reaching a breaking point, then maybe they were never as different from us as we once believed. And then the story reached a point where everything that came before suddenly felt like it had been leading here. Not as a coincidence, not as a poetic conclusion, but as a decision. A calculated response to a problem that had already begun to spiral out of control. Because after the rebellion of the Igigi, after the refusal to continue the labor that sustained their system, the Anunnaki were left with a choice. Not about belief, not about morality, but about function. How do you maintain a system when those responsible for its operation can no longer endure it? And what followed didn't feel like mythology anymore. It felt like strategy. Because instead of eliminating the problem, instead of restoring order through force, they chose something else. They chose to create, not life in the abstract sense, not existence for its own sake, but a solution. Something designed to take over the labor, to carry the burden, to replace the role that had just been abandoned. And that creation, according to these accounts, was humanity. And I remember sitting there, reading that line slowly, feeling that same quiet stillness settle in again, because this wasn't framed as a miracle. It wasn't described as a moment of divine inspiration or love. It was presented as a response, a necessity. Humans were created to work, to serve, to fulfill a role within a system that already existed before them. And at first, I tried to interpret it symbolically, to bring it back into something more familiar. The idea of being formed from clay mixed with the essence of a god. Something poetic, something metaphorical, something that could be explained as ancient storytelling. But then I looked closer at the pattern again, the consistency across different interpretations, the way these descriptions hinted not just at creation, but at process. And that's when another possibility began to surface, one that felt far more modern than it should have, the idea of modification, of combining existing biological forms with something new, of altering, enhancing, reshaping, and suddenly the language of ancient texts started to echo something we understand today in a completely different context, genetic engineering. And I paused there longer than before, because this wasn't just a reinterpretation, this was a shift in perspective that connected something ancient with something deeply contemporary. Because if these accounts are describing anything beyond metaphor, if they are pointing even loosely toward a process rather than a miracle, then what we are looking at is not creation in the traditional sense. It is design. And that realization carries a weight that is difficult to ignore. Because design implies intention. It implies purpose defined by something external, something beyond the thing being created. And that's when the thought returned again, clearer now, sharper than before. What if we were engineered? Not born from randomness, not shaped solely by natural evolution, but influenced, guided, altered in ways we no longer fully understand. And I could feel that resistance rise up again, that instinct to push the idea away, to protect the framework I had always relied on. Because this is where the line becomes difficult to walk, between curiosity and speculation, between possibility and belief. But even as I tried to step back, the logic of the narrative held its ground. A civilization arrives with a mission. They face a labor problem, the workers rebel, and a new solution is created to replace them. It follows a sequence that feels coherent, almost uncomfortably so. And the more I sat with it, the more I realized that what unsettled me wasn't just the idea itself, but how naturally it seemed to fit within everything that had come before. Because if humanity began as a solution, if our origin is tied even partially to function rather than chance, then the question is no longer just about where we came from, it's about why, and whether that original purpose, whatever it was, still echoes in the way we live, work, and build our world today. And that's a question that doesn't resolve easily. It lingers quietly, just beneath the surface, waiting to be asked again. And this is where the questions stopped being about them and started becoming about us. Because up until now, I had been looking outward, at ancient texts, at civilizations long gone, at the possibility that something beyond our understanding once interacted with this world. But eventually, all of that leads back to a much more personal question. Who are we, really? Not in the philosophical sense, not in terms of identity or purpose, but in terms of origin. Because if even a small part of those ancient accounts holds some truth, then the story of humanity might not be as simple as we've been taught. And that's when I found myself returning to something I had always accepted without question: evolution, the gradual development of life over millions of years, shaped by natural selection, mutation, and adaptation, a process that is slow, continuous, and, for the most part, predictable in its patterns. And for a long time in the half, that explanation felt complete. It made sense, until I began to look closer at one particular moment in that timeline, the transition from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens. Because on the surface, it's presented as just another step in the evolutionary chain, one species giving way to another over time. But when you examine it more closely, something about that transition feels abrupt. Because for hundreds of thousands of years, early human ancestors showed relatively gradual changes, improvements in tool use, social behavior, and survival strategies. But then, within what is considered a relatively short period of time in evolutionary terms, something changed dramatically. Suddenly, there was a leap in cognitive ability. Language became more complex. Art appeared. Symbolic thinking emerged. Societies began to organize in ways that had never been seen before. And I remember staring at that timeline, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I had always believed. Because evolution, as we understand it, doesn't usually move in leaps like that. It doesn't suddenly accelerate without a clear cause. It progresses through small, incremental changes over vast stretches of time. And yet, here we are, a species that at some point seemed to cross a threshold, not just becoming more capable, but becoming something fundamentally different. And that's where the question started to take shape again, quietly at first, but persistent. What triggered that shift? Was it purely natural? A result of environmental pressure, genetic mutation, or social development? Or is there something else, something we haven't fully accounted for? And this is where some interpretations begin to intersect with those ancient accounts. The idea that early hominids, perhaps Homo erectus, may have been altered in some way, modified, enhanced, guided toward a different outcome. And I'll admit, this is where it becomes difficult, because it challenges a framework that has been built on decades of scientific research and evidence. And yet, even within that framework, there are gaps, questions that remain open, explanations that are still being debated. And I found myself sitting with that uncertainty, not trying to resolve it immediately, but simply acknowledging it. Because uncertainty, when approached carefully, isn't a weakness. It's an invitation to look deeper. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this isn't about rejecting evolution. It's about understanding it more completely. Because if evolution is the story we've been given, then perhaps we're still missing a chapter. A moment where something influenced the trajectory in a way we don't yet fully understand. And that thought doesn't lead to a conclusion. It leads to another question, one that feels both simple and profound. If there was a moment where our development changed direction, where our capabilities expanded beyond what would normally be expected, then what caused it? And whatever that answer is, does it come from within the natural world or from something beyond it? And this is where it stopped feeling like coincidence altogether, because once I began to place these pieces side by side, not just within one culture, but across entirely different traditions, something started to emerge that I couldn't easily dismiss anymore. A pattern, not just in structure or behavior, but in narrative itself. And it led me to something I thought I already understood, the story of Adam, a story so familiar, so deeply embedded in religious tradition that I had never really questioned it beyond its symbolic meaning. A man formed from the dust of the earth, given life by a divine breath, placed in a garden, and then cast out after gaining knowledge. It was a story about innocence, about choice, about consequence. Or at least that's how I had always seen it. Until I began to notice something that made me pause. Because in the Sumerian accounts, there's a name that appears again and again, Adamu, described as the first of a new kind of being, created with intention, shaped for a purpose, endowed with certain capabilities that made him different from what came before. And I remember staring at those two names, Adamu and Adam, and feeling that quiet shift again, not because of the similarity itself, but because of what surrounded it. Because both accounts describe a moment of creation that is not entirely natural, something formed from the earth, but also infused with something more, something that elevates it beyond what would otherwise exist. And then there's the environment, the Garden of Eden, often interpreted as a place of perfection, a symbolic representation of harmony between humanity and the divine. But in some interpretations, especially when viewed through the lens of those earlier Sumerian narratives, it begins to take on a different shape, less like a paradise and more like a controlled space, a place where the first humans were not just placed, but observed, perhaps even developed. And I remember hesitating at that thought, because it felt like crossing a line, moving from interpretation into something that borders on speculation. But the more I looked at the parallels, the harder it became to ignore them, because both narratives involve creation from the earth. Both involve the introduction of knowledge, both involve a transition from one state of existence to another, and both suggest that something about humanity changed at that moment, something fundamental. And that's when the discomfort began to settle in more deeply, because this wasn't just about ancient texts anymore. This was about two of the most influential narratives in human history, intersecting in a way that raised more questions than it answered. And I found myself asking, not with certainty, but with a growing sense of curiosity that felt impossible to quiet. What if these are not separate stories? What if they are different interpretations of the same event, told through different lenses, shaped by different cultures, but rooted in a shared origin? And that's where the idea of Eden began to shift in my mind, from a symbolic garden to something more structured, a place with purpose, with boundaries, with conditions that were not entirely natural. And I'll admit, this is where I started to feel that sense of hesitation again, because once you begin to see these connections, it becomes difficult to return to a simpler explanation, because now every detail feels like it might mean something more. Every similarity feels less like coincidence and more like echo, and that's when the thought settled in, quietly but firmly. I can't ignore this anymore. Not because it proves anything, not because it confirms a hidden truth, but because it opens a possibility that feels too consistent to dismiss outright. And once that possibility exists, even as a question, it changes the way you look at everything that comes after. Because now, the story of humanity is no longer just about where we came from, it's about how those stories have been told, and whether beneath all the symbolism there is something much older, still waiting to be understood. And this is where I started to feel uncomfortable. Not because of something dramatic or obvious, but because of something subtle, something quiet that sits beneath everything we think we understand about ourselves. Because at some point, I stopped looking at ancient texts and started looking inward, into the one thing we all carry without question, our own biology, our DNA, the code that defines what we are, how we develop, how we function, how we even think. And for a long time, I believed that this code, as complex as it is, was entirely the product of natural processes, shaped over millions of years through mutation and selection, a system refined slowly, imperfectly, but consistently, until I came across something that didn't quite fit that narrative. Something small at first glance, but difficult to ignore once you notice it. Human chromosome 2. Now, in most primates, there are 24 pairs of chromosomes. Chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, all of them follow this pattern. But humans, we have 23, and that difference has been studied extensively, explained through what is known as a chromosomal fusion. Two ancestral chromosomes at some point in our evolutionary past are believed to have joined together to form what we now call chromosome 2. And on paper, that explanation makes sense. It fits within the framework of evolutionary biology. But when you look closer, when you examine the structure of that chromosome, the way the fusion appears, the remnants of what looks like two separate entities combined into one, it begins to raise questions. Not necessarily contradictions, but curiosities, because this kind of fusion is not something we observe happening frequently. It's a rare event, one that would have significant consequences, and yet it became a defining feature of our species. And I remember sitting with that information, trying to understand what it really meant. Not just in scientific terms, but in a broader sense. Because if there was a moment where two separate genetic structures became one, if something altered the blueprint in a way that set us apart from every other primate, then that moment matters. It becomes a point of transition, a threshold where something changed. And then there's something else, and something even harder to fully grasp. Because when scientists map the human genome, they've found that a vast portion of it, around 98%, does not code for proteins. It doesn't directly contribute to the building of cells in the way we might expect. And for years, this was referred to as junk DNA, a term that suggests irrelevance, leftover fragments without function. But more recent research has begun to challenge that idea, and suggesting that this non-coding DNA may play regulatory roles, structural roles, functions that we are only beginning to understand. And that's where the discomfort deepened for me, because we are looking at a system that is incredibly complex, incredibly precise, and yet we still don't fully understand how it works or why it is structured the way it is. And I found myself asking a question that I didn't expect to ask, not as a conclusion, but as a possibility. What if there's more to this code than we currently recognize? What if some of what we see as unexplained complexity is not random, but intentional in ways we haven't yet identified? And I hesitated even thinking that, because it's easy to move too quickly from curiosity into speculation. But the feeling remained, that quiet sense that there is something here we haven't fully uncovered yet. Something that sits at the intersection of what we know and what we don't. And that's when I realized why this made me uncomfortable. Because it's one thing to question ancient stories, to explore possibilities about distant civilizations or unknown beings, but it's something else entirely to question the very foundation of what we are. Because if there are gaps in our understanding of our own genetic code, if there are moments in our evolutionary history that feel abrupt or unexplained, then the question is no longer just about the past. It's about identity, about origin, about whether we fully understand the process that led to our existence. And that's a question that doesn't have an easy answer. But once it's asked, it doesn't go away. And this is where everything I had been holding together, carefully, cautiously, began to pull in two different directions. Because on one side, there is everything we know, or at least everything we believe we know. The framework of evolution, the accumulation of evidence, the consistency of scientific understanding that has been built over generations, a system that explains so much of how life develops, adapts, and changes over time. And I've always trusted that it's grounded, it's tested, it's something you can rely on. But on the other side, there are these questions, these patterns, these fragments that don't quite fit neatly into that framework. Ancient texts that describe creation not as a slow process, but as an event, sudden shifts in human capability that feel difficult to explain through gradual change alone. Genetic structures that raise curiosity more than they provide closure. And the more I tried to keep these two perspectives separate, the harder it became, because they kept overlapping. Not completely, not in a way that resolves into a single answer, but just enough to create tension. And I found myself sitting with that tension, not trying to resolve it immediately, but simply experiencing it. Because sometimes the most honest place to be is not in certainty, but in uncertainty. And this is where the question became more personal than I expected, because it's no longer just about ancient beings or distant planets. It's about us, about what we are, and how we came to be. Are we the result of a natural process that unfolded over millions of years, shaped by forces we are still trying to fully understand? Or is there a possibility, however small, that something influenced that process in a way we haven't yet recognized? And I can feel that resistance rise up even as I ask that. The instinct to protect what feels stable, what feels proven, what's real, because questioning origin is not a small thing, it touches everything. Identity, purpose, meaning, and yet the questions remain quietly, persistently, and I can't ignore them anymore. Not because they prove anything, but because they exist. And that existence alone is enough to change the way I see things. Because now, when I look at the story of humanity, I don't just see a single path. I see layers, possibilities, intersections where different explanations overlap without fully merging. And I realize that maybe the goal isn't to choose one over the other. Maybe it's to hold both carefully without forcing them into agreement, because there is value in what we know, and there is value in what we are still trying to understand. And somewhere between those two is where we are right now, still learning, still questioning, still searching for something that feels complete. And this is where the thought returns one last time, not as a conclusion, but as a reflection. Part of me still doesn't believe this. I still hold on to the explanations that have guided us for so long, but another part of me, quieter, less certain, can't unsee what I've already seen, can't ignore the patterns, the questions, the possibilities that have emerged along the way. And maybe that's where this journey really begins, not in finding answers, but in learning how to sit with the questions that refuse to disappear. And after everything I had been reading, everything I had been questioning, I found myself looking not at texts this time, but at something far more tangible, something that still stands today, silent, unmoving, yet somehow louder than any story ever written: the pyramids, especially those at Giza, because no matter how many times you see them, no matter how many documentaries or explanations you come across, there is always that quiet moment when you stop and think, how? Not just in a general sense, but in a very specific, grounded way. How were these structures built with such precision, such scale, such alignment, at a time when the tools we associate with that level of engineering simply didn't exist in the way we understand them today? And I remember looking into the details, not the surface explanations, but the deeper measurements, the alignments, the calculations that have been studied over and over again. The Great Pyramid, aligned almost perfectly with the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, with a level of accuracy that is difficult to replicate even with modern instruments. The sheer number of stone blocks, millions of them, each weighing tons, some even reaching weights that would challenge modern machinery. And then there's the internal structure, chambers, passageways, angles that seem to follow mathematical principles far beyond what we typically attribute to that time period. And I tried again to stay grounded, to remind myself that there are explanations, that archaeologists and engineers have proposed methods, theories, models that attempt to reconstruct how these could have been built. And many of those explanations are compelling. They speak of large workforces, of ramps, of coordination, of ingenuity and persistence. And I don't dismiss that, because human capability, especially when driven by necessity and organization, can achieve extraordinary things. But even with those explanations, there's still something that lingers, something that doesn't fully settle, because it's not just about the construction, it's about the precision, the consistency, the alignment, not just with the earth, but in some interpretations with the stars themselves. And then there's the Sphinx, sitting there, carved from a single mass of stone, weathered in ways that some researchers argue suggest an age far older than traditionally accepted. Its expression unchanged, its presence almost watchful, as if it has been observing something we've long forgotten. And I found myself standing, at least in my mind, in front of these structures, trying to imagine the moment they were built. not as ruins, not as historical artifacts, but as something new, something complete. And I couldn't help but feel that same quiet tension again. Because even today, with all our technology, all our knowledge, all our tools, we struggle to explain this. Not entirely, not in a way that closes every question. And that's where the curiosity deepens, because if these structures are the result of human effort alone, then they represent a level of coordination, knowledge, and precision that we are only beginning to fully appreciate. But if there is even a small possibility that something else influenced their construction, something that guided, assisted, or shared knowledge in ways we don't yet fully understand, then these structures become something more than monuments. They become traces, echoes of an interaction that may have left its mark not in stories alone, but in stone. And that thought doesn't lead to a conclusion, it leads to a feeling. A quiet awareness that there is still more here than we have fully uncovered, something that stands in front of us, unchanged, waiting, not to reveal itself, but to be understood. And maybe that's why they endure, not just as symbols of the past, but as questions carved into the very surface of our world. And after spending time with those structures, those silent, immovable questions carved in stone, I found myself drawn towards something less visible, but just as unsettling. Knowledge. Not the kind we casually associate with early civilizations, but something far more precise, far more advanced than it should have been for its time. Because when you begin to look closely at what these ancient cultures understood about the world around them, especially the sky above, it becomes difficult to explain it as simple observation or gradual discovery alone. The Sumerians, for example, developed systems of astronomy that tracked the movements of celestial bodies with remarkable accuracy. They mapped stars, identified patterns, and created calendars that reflected cycles far more complex than what we would expect from a civilization at that stage of development. And it wasn't just about recognizing constellations. It was about understanding motion, predicting events, aligning their lives and structures with something vast and distant. And then there were the Egyptians, whose knowledge of the stars, of geometry, of measurement, allowed them to create systems of time that still influence how we measure days and years today, a 365-day calendar, long before the tools we now rely on even existed. And I remember sitting with that realization, letting it settle in slowly. Because this wasn't just knowledge for survival. This was knowledge of patterns that required observation over long periods of time, precision that suggested more than trial and error. And then there's mathematics, not just basic counting or simple calculations, but systems that allowed for the construction of complex structures, for the measurement of land, for the organization of society itself, the use of numerical systems that still echo in how we measure time. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, remnants of a base 60 system that originated thousands of years ago. And I found myself wondering, how does a civilization arrive at that level of abstraction, that level of precision so early in its development? Because knowledge like this doesn't usually appear fully formed. It evolves, it builds, it refines itself over generations. And yet, in these ancient contexts, it often seems to emerge already structured, already functional. And that's when the feeling returned again, that quiet, persistent sense that something doesn't quite align with the timeline we've been given. Because when you look at the sky, when you study the movement of stars and planets, you are looking at patterns that require patience, consistency, and a framework of understanding that goes beyond simple observation. And yet somehow, these civilizations not only observed them, they integrated them into their architecture, their calendars, their belief systems. And I remember thinking, almost without realizing it, they knew too much, too early. Not in a way that dismisses their intelligence or their capability, but in a way that raises questions about where that knowledge came from. Was it developed independently through careful observation and gradual refinement over centuries? Or was there a moment, a point in time where knowledge was introduced, accelerated, or shared in a way that changed the trajectory of human understanding? And again, I found myself caught between explanations, because it's entirely possible that human ingenuity, given enough time and motivation, could reach these levels of understanding. but the consistency, the alignment, the way these systems appear across different cultures, it creates a pattern that is difficult to ignore. Because if knowledge like this emerged independently in multiple places at similar points in history, then we are looking at something extraordinary. But if it didn't, if there was some form of influence, some exchange of information that we have not fully accounted for, then the implications become much deeper. Because knowledge is not just information, it is direction. It shapes how a civilization grows, how it builds, how it understands its place in the world. And if that direction was influenced even slightly by something beyond what we currently recognize, then the story of human progress may not be as isolated as we once believed. And that thought lingers quietly just beneath the surface, not as a conclusion, but as a possibility that feels just present enough to be difficult to ignore. And the more I looked at each piece on its own, the more I felt I was missing something. Because it wasn't until I stepped back and began to look at them together that the pattern truly began to take shape, not just within a single civilization, not just within one region or one timeline, but across the world, across cultures that, as far as we understand, had no direct contact with one another. And yet, somehow, they seemed to be telling the same story. And that realization didn't come all at once. It came gradually, through small connections, subtle similarities that at first felt easy to dismiss, but then began to accumulate. Sumer, for example, speaks of beings who descended from the sky, who shaped humanity, who established systems of rule and knowledge. Egypt tells of gods who came down to earth, who ruled among men, who were associated with the stars, with creation, with order. And then you look further, across oceans into Mesoamerican cultures like the Maya, and you find stories of sky beings once again, figures who brought knowledge, who influenced the development of civilization, who were later remembered as gods. And I remember pausing at that point, not because of any single detail, but because of the repetition. Because repetition across distance and time is not something that happens easily, especially when those cultures developed independently, separated by geography, language, and history. And yet here they were, describing something that felt remarkably similar, not identical, not in a way that suggests Drahakang, but aligned in theme, in structure, in the role these beings played within each narrative. And that's when the question surfaced again, quietly but persistently. Different cultures, same story? Because if these accounts were purely symbolic, purely the result of human imagination, then why do they converge in such specific ways? Why do they consistently describe beings who come from above, who possess advanced knowledge, who interact with humanity in formative ways, and then either leave or ascend? And I tried once again to ground myself in a more conventional explanation that human beings, regardless of where they are, tend to look to the sky to create meaning around what they don't understand. That the stars, the sun, the vastness above us naturally inspires stories of higher beings, of creators, of watchers. And that explanation does make sense to a point. But the deeper I looked, the more I noticed that these weren't just stories about the sky. They were stories about interaction, about influence, about moments where something descended, engaged, and altered the course of human development. And that distinction matters. Because inspiration and interaction are not the same thing. And yet, these narratives blur that line in a way that feels intentional, as if they are describing something that was experienced but interpreted through the only language available at the time. And I found myself sitting with that idea longer than I expected, because it introduces a possibility that is difficult to resolve. Either these cultures, separated by vast distances, independently created remarkably similar stories about sky beings influencing humanity, or they are all referencing something that in some form connects them. Not necessarily in a literal, direct sense, but in a way that suggests a shared origin, or at least a shared influence. And that thought doesn't lead to certainty, it leads to reflection. Because if there is even a small chance that these stories are connected, that they are fragments of a larger narrative that has been told in different ways across time and space, then what we are looking at is not just mythology, it is memory, scattered, reshaped, reinterpreted, but still carrying something at its core that has endured. And that realization doesn't answer the question, it deepens it. Because now, it's not just about whether these beings existed. It's about why so many civilizations felt the need to remember them in such similar ways, and what it means that those stories are still here, waiting to be noticed. And just when I thought I had reached the edge of what I could reasonably question, the story pulled me even further, into a place where history, belief, and something far more difficult to define begin to overlap. Because this time, it wasn't coming from Mesopotamia or Egypt or distant civilizations across the ocean. It was coming from texts that have shaped entire belief systems for thousands of years, the Bible and writings connected to it. Texts that, for most of my life, I had never thought to examine in this way, not as spiritual narratives, but as descriptions, accounts, attempts to explain something that may have been witnessed, but not fully understood. And one of the first moments that stood out to me was the vision of Ezekiel, a passage that describes something descending from the sky, something complex, structured, almost mechanical in the way it moves, wheels within wheels, moving in multiple directions without turning, accompanied by a sound like rushing wind, like a force that couldn't be contained or easily described. And I remember reading that slowly, trying to picture it not as symbolism, not as metaphor, but as experience. What would it look like to someone who had no concept of machinery, no vocabulary for technology, trying to describe something that didn't belong to their world? And that's when the thought came back again. Stronger this time, more difficult to dismiss. What if ancient people were describing something real, using the only language they had? Because when you remove the assumption that these are purely symbolic visions, when you allow for the possibility that they are interpretations of something tangible, something seen, something experienced, the descriptions begin to take on a different shape, not as divine imagery, but as observation filtered through limited understanding. And then there is the Book of Enoch, a text that exists on the edges of traditional canon, yet carries narratives that feel strangely aligned with everything I had been exploring. Accounts of beings descending from the heavens, interacting with humans, sharing knowledge, forming connections that led to the existence of something new. The Nephilim, described as giants, beings of great size and strength, neither fully divine nor fully human. And again, I found myself pausing, because this wasn't an isolated idea. It echoed the same themes I had already encountered: beings from above, interaction, transformation, something that changes the course of humanity in a way that leaves a lasting imprint. And the presence of giants, whether interpreted literally or symbolically, adds another layer to that narrative. Because throughout history, across different cultures, there are references to beings larger than humans, stronger, more powerful, often associated with divine lineage or otherworldly origin. And I tried, once again, to ground myself, to remind myself that these texts are deeply symbolic, that they carry spiritual meaning, that they are not meant to be read as literal historical records, and that perspective is important. It provides context, it respects the traditions from which these texts come. But even within that context, the consistency remains, the repetition of themes, the alignment of ideas, the way these narratives intersect with accounts from entirely different parts of the world. And that's where the tension returns, because now it's not just about one culture, one text, or one interpretation. It's about a pattern that spans across belief systems, across time, across geography. And I find myself sitting with that pattern, not trying to force it into a single explanation, but simply observing it. Because sometimes the most important step is not to conclude, but to recognize, to see that something is there, even if we don't yet fully understand what it means. And maybe that's what makes this moment feel like a turning point, a kind of quiet culmination of everything that came before. Because now the question is no longer just about ancient civilizations or distant planets, it's about how we interpret the stories we've inherited. And whether, beneath the layers of symbolism and belief, there is something that has been seen, experienced, and remembered in ways we are only now beginning to reconsider. And just when it felt like the story had already stretched as far as it could go, when the questions had already reached into history, into belief, into the very structure of who we are, there was one more pattern that I couldn't ignore. Something that appeared again and again, across civilizations that should never have shared the same memory. The flood, a great flood, a catastrophic event that reset everything. And I remember noticing it almost casually at first. A reference here, a story there, until it became impossible to overlook, because it wasn't just one culture describing it. Mesopotamia spoke of Ziusudra, a man warned by a higher being to build a vessel, to survive a coming destruction that would wipe out humanity. The waters rising, covering the land, leaving only a few to begin again. And then in another tradition, one that I had known my entire life, the story appears again. Noah, building an ark, gathering life, enduring a flood that lasts for days and nights until the world is cleared of what once existed. And I remember sitting with that realization, not because the stories were identical, but because they were so similar in structure, in purpose, in outcome. A warning, a preparation, a destruction, and then a restart. And as I began to look further, the pattern extended even beyond those two narratives. Ancient cultures in different parts of the world, from the Americas to Asia, also carry stories of great floods, of civilizations wiped away, of survivors who carry knowledge into a new beginning. And that's when the thought formed again, quietly but with a weight that felt different this time. Too many flood stories across the world, because coincidence can explain one or two similarities, maybe even a few. But when the same core event appears in so many places across such vast distances, it begins to feel less like coincidence and more like something remembered, something that left an imprint deep enough to survive through generations, through language, through time itself. And I tried again to ground myself in what we understand, that floods do happen, that ancient civilizations often formed near rivers, near water sources that could both sustain and destroy them, that large-scale flooding events could have inspired these stories, shaped them, passed them down as warnings or lessons. And that explanation holds weight. It's logical, it fits within what we know about climate and geography. But even with that, something still lingers. Because these stories are not just about water, they are about intention, about a decision to reset, to clear, to begin again. And that element, the idea that the flood was not just a natural disaster, but something directed, something purposeful. That's where the narrative shifts again. Because now the flood is not just an event, it's a turning point, a moment where everything that existed before was brought to an end, and something new was allowed to emerge. And I found myself wondering, not as a conclusion, but as a question that feels difficult to ignore. If there was a moment in our past where humanity was reset, where only fragments survived, carrying forward stories that became myths, legends, beliefs, then how much of what we think we know is built on what came after that reset and what might have been lost before it? And that's where the feeling deepens again. That quiet sense that history may not be a continuous line, but something broken, interrupted, restarted. And if that's true, then the stories we've inherited may not just be symbolic, they may be echoes, fragments of something that happened, something that changed the course of everything that followed. And that thought doesn't bring clarity, it brings a kind of stillness, because once you consider it, even as a possibility, it changes the way you look at the past. Not as something fully understood, but as something that may still be hiding pieces of itself, just beneath the surface, waiting to be seen again. And then, just as the story begins to feel like it has revealed something profound, something that reshapes how we look at our past, it takes a quieter turn. Not an ending, not a resolution, but a fading. Because, according to these interpretations, there came a point where the presence of these beings on Earth began to diminish. Not suddenly, not in a dramatic departure, but gradually, almost as if something had changed somewhere far beyond this world. And that change, as the narrative suggests, began on Nibiru, the place they once came from, a world that had been in crisis, that had driven them to search for resources, to travel, to act with urgency. But over time, that urgency faded. The conditions that once demanded their presence here began to stabilize. The need that brought them to Earth slowly disappeared, and with that, their reason to remain began to fade as well. And I remember sitting with that idea, not as a conclusion, but as a feeling, because there's something quietly melancholic about it. The idea that something so significant, something that may have shaped the very beginning of our story, simply left, not as an ending, but as a withdrawal, as if a chapter closed without explanation. And then there's the other layer, the one that makes it feel even more human, even more familiar. The idea of conflict, not just between humans and these beings, but among the Anunnaki themselves. Internal divisions, disagreements, tensions that grew over time, shaping decisions in ways we can only partially understand. Because if they were organized, if they had structure, hierarchy, roles, then conflict is not just possible, it's inevitable. And that thought, it brings the story back into something recognizable. Because civilizations, no matter how advanced, are rarely free from internal struggle. And I found myself wondering, not just about what brought them here, but what caused them to leave. Was it simply that their mission was complete? That the resource they needed was no longer required? Or was it something more complex? Something shaped by disagreements, by shifting priorities, by a system that could no longer hold itself together in the way it once did? And the idea that their departure was not clean, not unified, but fragmented, makes the silence they left behind feel even deeper. Because what remains is not a clear ending, but an absence, a space where something once existed and then gradually disappeared. And that absence, it carries a kind of weight. Because if they were here, if they influenced, guided, or even shaped parts of our early development, then their departure leaves behind a question that doesn't easily settle. What happens to a civilization when the influence that helped shape it is suddenly gone? Do we continue forward, building on what we've been given? Or do we slowly lose the understanding of where it came from, turning knowledge into myth, memory into story, reality into something that feels distant and symbolic? And that's where the tone shifts again into something quieter, more reflective, because this isn't just about them leaving, it's about what was left behind. Fragments of knowledge, structures that outlast their creators, stories that survive without context. And I can't help but feel that sense of quiet loss, not because we know for certain that something was taken away, but because it feels like something might have been, something we once understood or were meant to understand, but no longer do. And maybe that's why the story lingers the way it does, not as a clear narrative with a defined ending, but as something unfinished, something that fades out instead of concluding, leaving us here, trying to piece together what remains and wondering quietly whether what we're looking for was never truly gone or simply beyond our reach. And what stayed with me the most wasn't the idea that they might have left, it was what remained after they were gone. Because when you look closely at the layers of early civilization, there's a pattern that begins to emerge, not just in structures or stories, but in power itself. The rise of kings who were not simply rulers, but something more, figures who claimed authority not from the people, but from the heavens, divine kingship. A concept that appears again and again across ancient cultures, in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in other early societies where rulers were seen not just as leaders, but as intermediaries, or even descendants of the gods themselves. And I remember pausing there because it felt like a continuation of something, not a beginning, as if the authority once held by these higher beings didn't disappear. It was transferred, adapted, carried forward through human structures that mirrored what came before. And that idea, it changes the way you look at power in the ancient world, because instead of seeing it as something that developed naturally, it begins to feel like something inherited, something modeled after a system that already existed. And then there's the knowledge, the fragments of understanding that seem to appear early, almost fully formed, and then slowly fade into myth over time. Stories of technologies, of capabilities, of knowledge that feels out of place, not because it's impossible, but because it seems to arrive too soon and then disappear too completely. And I found myself thinking about how often that happens, not just in distant history, but even in smaller ways. Knowledge that is lost, rediscovered, misunderstood, or reinterpreted as something symbolic because its original context is gone. And that's when the thought came back again, quieter this time, but deeper. We didn't lose history, we forgot it. Not in the sense that everything vanished, but in the sense that meaning was slowly stripped away. That what once may have been understood as real, as functional, as part of everyday existence, became distant, abstract, turned into stories that we now interpret through a completely different lens. And I sat with that idea for a while because it carries a kind of quiet weight. Because forgetting is not the same as losing. Forgetting means something remains, but we no longer recognize it for what it is. It means the structures are still there, the stories are still told, the symbols still appear, but the understanding behind them has shifted. And that shift can happen gradually, over generations, over centuries, until what was once clear becomes mysterious, and what was once practical becomes mythical. And I found myself wondering, not just about the past, but about the present. How much of what we see today, how much of what we assume is symbolic or primitive, might actually be something else entirely, something we've misinterpreted because we no longer have the framework to understand it properly. And that thought doesn't lead to certainty, it leads to a kind of reflection, a quiet reconsideration of what history really is. Because maybe history isn't just a record of what happened. Maybe it's also a record of what we've misunderstood. And if that's true, then the question isn't just about uncovering new information, it's about re-seeing what's already there. Looking at it again, without the assumptions we've carried for so long, and allowing for the possibility that beneath the layers of myth and interpretation, there might still be something real, something that hasn't disappeared, but simply changed form, waiting, not to be discovered for the first time, but to be recognized again. And after everything, all the fragments, the patterns, the questions that seem to connect across time, I found myself returning to one final thought, not as an answer, but as something that lingers quietly, refusing to fully settle. Because even now in our modern world, with all the tools we have, all the knowledge we've accumulated, there are still things we can't fully explain. And some of those things feel strangely familiar. The idea of a distant planet, for example. Something beyond the edge of what we can easily observe. What scientists today refer to as Planet 9, a massive body unseen, inferred only through the way it influences the orbits of objects far out in our solar system. And I remember reading about that, not as proof of anything, but as a reminder that even now there are parts of our own cosmic neighborhood that remain hidden, undefined, waiting to be confirmed. And it made me think, not in a definitive way, but in a reflective one, about how easily something can exist beyond our awareness, influencing what we see without being directly visible itself. And then there are the sightings, the reports, the things people describe in the sky that don't behave the way anything we've built behaves. Objects that move without inertia, that change direction in ways that defy our understanding of physics, that appear and disappear without explanation. And I'm careful with that, because it's easy to jump to conclusions, to connect dots that don't belong together. But at the same time, it's difficult to ignore the fact that even official discussions now acknowledge the existence of phenomena we cannot yet fully identify. And that alone is enough to keep the question open. And then there are the stories, the prophecies, the interpretations of ancient texts that suggest that whatever once came here, whatever may have influenced the earliest chapters of our history, could one day return, not necessarily in a dramatic or catastrophic way, but as a continuation, a cycle, something that unfolds over time rather than appearing all at once. And I don't take that as prediction or certain, but as another thread in the larger pattern, another piece that adds to the sense that this story, whatever it truly is, may not be as complete as we think. And that's where everything comes together. Not into a conclusion, but into a realization that the deeper you go, the more you begin to see that history is not as fixed as it seems, that the boundaries between myth, memory, and reality are not always as clear as we would like them to be. And I find myself sitting with that, not trying to resolve it, not trying to force it into something definitive, but simply allowing it to exist as a possibility. Because sometimes the most honest place to be is not in certainty, but in awareness. Awareness that there are still questions we haven't answered, still patterns we don't fully understand, still connections that feel just out of reach. And maybe that's where this journey ends, or perhaps where it truly begins. Because I'm not saying the Anunnaki are real. I'm not asking you to believe that everything we've explored here is true. But if even a fraction of this is true, even a small part of it, then it means something far more significant than any single theory or story. It means we may have misunderstood our entire origin. And if that's the case, then the question is no longer just about the past. It's about what we choose to see and what we are willing to question moving forward.